a senior associate at Urban Peace Institute. Our work is on violence prevention, violence reduction. Primarily, we do that through three ways. One, training and technical assistance. Two, smart justice. And three, in our place-based initiatives. But essentially helping cities, communities, organizations to build capacity and to implement a comprehensive violence reduction strategy.
Okay.
I wanted to work on systemic change, and so the work that we've done here isn't so much about a program that does XYZ, but a multifaceted program that's focused on changing and moving the engines of government to respond to community needs, primarily through a public health approach, and to stop violence, to reduce the bloodshed in communities that are suffering from high levels of violence.
Okay.
Well, I think every day is different. We have multiple projects, but for me, one is always checking in with local stakeholders, helping some of our stakeholders and our partners move and implement the strategy, whether it be from a conceptual planning stage to implementation to troubleshooting to working with our partners within government, outside of government, within the community that are residents, and to some of the professionals within those spaces to move the work forward. Well, essentially, I'll put it like this: we don't work in areas where there is peace. We tend to parachute in and work in communities that are dealing with people dying, people being killed, gunshots, where there is a lot of root causes to that. So we want to strive to achieve peace, but I think I would define it as when people, children, youth, families are free from fear of violence, where they're safe, where they can focus on the other parts of their life that isn't hindered by the fear of insecurity, or what I mean by that or a lack of safety.
Yes.
Our work really is impacted our work is data driven, so the numbers are evaluated. I think one of the best measures is in homicide rates and shots fired. Then those are some of the big metrics that can really speak to the effectiveness of the work. And then once you achieve a baseline level of safety, you can start focusing on some of the other things. Well, I think one of the biggest things I'd say is I think our advocacy work really is around advocating for the right solutions. What happens in many communities that they're struggling with new levels of violence, their first response is to throw law enforcement at it, and at times ineffective policing can actually further entrench crime and violence. It can deepen the cycle of violence, and I think that's a very initially what folks think of, but what we see is there needs to be a broader investment, a broader public investment in communities and safety and leadership in building out a prevention infrastructure, and also, defining and making sure that law enforcement is doing an effective job that the community can also trust law enforcement as well.
Definitely.
Well, I think, for those that live in those communities, it's just being civically engaged. For other folks, there's so many opportunities, from providing direct services to, being part of government in these areas and being responsive to the needs, and really trying to address the root causes of violence, whether it be, some of those are well outlined on our website. I think one of the big ones is just really getting broad engagement by the larger community. I think sometimes one of the big things that happens in high violence communities, people become disassociated. Violence becomes normalized. They just accept the high levels of violence, and that's one of the biggest problems. And also with that is, at times, government can also become complacent and complicit. They just accept it as a normal reality, as opposed to taking more novel approaches and being nimble in their approach. I think really being clear on the mission and the messaging, and bringing along partners and building partnerships that are multi-sector, that involve community, that involve local government, that involve agency heads, that involve key government leaders, and just having multiple players at the table that can really can get on the same mission. I think one of the biggest things that our work really tries to do is how do you bring about community safety, and that there are multiple parts. It's from connecting with the local leaders in the community. It involves with connecting with the gang involved families, and it's involved with making sure government and law enforcement is part of government too, that they are able to address the root causes and actually have an approach that's more effective, and bringing all these stakeholders aligned on the same page. And that mission should be peace, and to reduce violence, reduce shootings, and the preservation of life, and enhance the quality of life for the people living in these areas.
Yes, I definitely agree. Okay, so there's some personal questions I have. So first,
there's multiple factors that play. I think one of the biggest ones is, as Father Greg Boyle would say from Homeboy Industries, is like, no kid ever runs to a gang for something. They're running away from something else. I think something that's really understated is the level of trauma and abuse that happens in these communities, whether it be from child abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, tend to factor in people joining. And also, if you think about it, people that are in gang life, that is very traumatic. You're constantly in fights. There's constantly physical violence, and also if you think of multi-generational gangs, that's usually, it's not, if you can imagine, there's also child abuse there, there's also drug abuse there. So that's one aspect, but also violence tends to thrive in situations where there are poor economic conditions, where it's hard to get a job. We see the high levels of gang entrenchment that happens throughout cities. It's like there's also usually job opportunities that are lacking. There's also poor schools, poor infrastructure. There isn't much of safe spaces and youth programming and youth leadership that's available. The lack of healthcare infrastructure, mental health care infrastructure as well, and also law enforcement also plays a role. Like in communities in which law enforcement has a bad reputation or a bad standing relationship with the community, that allows gang violence to thrive because people don't trust the police. So that's another thing that our work is also focused on, is really helping advance 21st century policing, what we call relationship-based policing, that is really focused on building authentic relationships with law enforcement, for law enforcement to take a different approach, a more authentic approach to building relationships while still lifting up procedural justice and constitutional policing. Well, I'll share with you. I went to a convention a couple years ago with the CIA analysts that they based the movie Zero Dark 30 on, and that same question was asked. I was like, oh, and she said, like, yeah, it comes from not addressing the root causes of terrorism, and the root causes of violence in general are kind of similar. Like what you have, and I think what's clear is like clearly marginalized people living in bad conditions. You know, that's what where violence tends to thrive, where abuse, whether it be child abuse, domestic abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, thrives because once again, there's a sense of lawlessness in these areas, and there is an ability for people to get out, and there's a lack of economic opportunities, there's a lack of educational opportunities, there's a lack of health resources, and all sorts of resources, you know. So I think to some degree, I think that's the better analogy. Providing good youth programming, quality youth programming that's accessible, that people can afford. So, for example, I was working in a project in East LA, and I was talking to a community member. She ended up losing her son. Her son was murdered, and he was a part of a gang, but also she had 5 other kids. And well, people say, like, hey, you should go to the park, and like one of her daughters wanted to join a softball league, and she's like, you know what, I got 4 other kids, like I can't pay $40 for 5 kids. That's $200, you know. So price, and I think that's what happens, especially in low-income communities, is like there is what I would call families in crisis. You know, it's really hard for some families that that are struggling with housing, struggling with basic food and income. And sometimes, mom might have her history of trauma, abuse, mental health needs, and maybe even drug addiction. So if you compound those things in poor areas, that's why they tend to happen there. But also what I think too is like, yes, programming for youth, but also the social and emotional support in these areas. And because you know, and for kids that are dealing with all these other social factors, and social determinants. But the one other one I'd say is, I had it at the tip of my tongue. Is also, yes, there needs to be these prevention programs and so forth, but also the intervention. So how do you help kids that are already involved? So like, you got to make sure that your prevention, that the kids have a place to go, but then also you have an ability to reach the kids that might already start becoming involved. Because what happens a lot of times is like, there can be youth programming, but it tends to focus on the good kids in the hood. But what about those real at-risk kids, those kids that are already got one foot in the door into the gang life? How do you get them out? How do you intervene? You know, so some of those programs targeting that early level intervention, and you know what, some kids, you know, that have been involved, you know, how can you help get them out? Well, you can see in the city of Los Angeles, we've been tracking since the implementation of the Mayor's Office of Gang Reduction and Youth Development, the GRID program. Violence has gone down here in Los Angeles from, you know, the early mid 90s, early 2000s. We were hovering around 1,300 murders a year. We're close to under 300. Close to 300 or under 300 the past 4 or 5 years. So we can see that there has been effect, but you can look at a place like Chicago where it's still blowing up, where we're still trying to support those communities to deal with dealing with their violence issues. So we'll also be trying to help Oakland as well. So I think here in Los Angeles, like, we've seen some best practices. One has been the investment in these hot zones, that there is investment in gang prevention, in gang intervention, in reentry services, but also the role of law enforcement as well. Specifically, LAPD taking a different approach with youth, working in coordination with other city agencies, and also for them to start building better relationships with the community has done a lot of positive things. But you can see in other communities like Chicago, where the lack of trust with law enforcement, and also I'd say to some degree ineffective policing tactics and relationships has further entrenched gang violence, like in a community like that. And also the city services and investments in safety haven't been adequate to the need, you know. So I think that's where it tends to rise, you know.
Yeah.
Do that. I don't do that, but we train people that are interventionists. So we train all the city's gang intervention workers, and we help other cities and communities to train their gang intervention specialists or community workers. They're called by different names, but they have the same mission: to build peace, to help provide an off-ramp to people that are already associated in that. And one of the big picture things is like, you want to help people transform their lives. You want to help people deal with like the multitude of issues surrounding them. But I leave that mostly up to the peacemakers that are usually from those communities, telling other people in their community and helping them build peace, because most of the former gang members that we work with, they've already had an immense amount of trauma and loss of family members, friends, and that authenticity of homegrown leadership, even with people that are former gang members, has an ability to affect people and affect the community that you or I as strangers would not be able to access. Well, I kind of speak to the big picture. I don't do that things directly, but we train people on how to do that. But one is definitely building those relationships before it happens, anticipating situations that might spark violence, whether it be someone being let out of prison, whether it be a funeral that is happening, whether it be an anniversary of someone's death, or a holiday that the neighborhood might celebrate or the local gang might celebrate. Anticipating those situations, being prepared for those situations is one. Building, and also the leading to the next part is also building some of those relationships and trust, so when stuff does happen, so if there's a shooting, that you have those relationships built, that you can actually access the community and prevent a retaliation, prevent and dispel rumors that might not be true, that might be fueling the violence, and then afterwards is still to continue building those relationships, strengthening those relationships, and really providing help to folks that want to get out, or even just helping folks in general through a multitude of factors, because most of this stuff really happens in poor communities. That it is. Like, this does happen in poor communities, and there's high need, and if you can be a resource to these people, it goes a long way in helping them find work, in helping them find tattoo removal, helping them find housing, stuff like that.
Any correlation between the media's influence on the youth to join gangs or to be violent to others? If so, how can the youth be educated about what they're being fed?
Well, I mean, I think it's, to some degree, it's, I don't think it does pay too much of an effect, because, like youth culture, you think of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, like youth culture is always there, back in, if you think about the stuff that people would criticize young people in the 70s and 80s compared to now, like, those things they always go on. But I don't think the media has a real role, but I think the more dangers are on social media. Social media allows people to connect in different ways, but it can fuel gang violence, because now all you have to do is take a picture, send it out, and then that information can just spread super duper quickly. It can cause, I mean, there's several instances of gang violence and just violence in general stemming from people trading disrespects on social media. So instead, like, back in the 80s and 90s, you just throw up your graffiti on the wall. Now you can throw up your insults on Instagram, Facebook, or a multitude of social media platforms, and do some of that social media banging, internet banging, which is actually real, So I think that's the bigger danger, as opposed to, I kind of seen it less. In my sense, is like, I think gang life portrayal in the broader media is far less than it was in the 90s. But there's also different avenues for people to connect and share, negative messages that can instill and spark violence. So I think that's the bigger danger is social media. Just like regular bullying can be dangerous for kids, but in communities that are dealing high levels of violence, it can take it to another level in high violence communities.